Today, I want to continue and expand the discussion that started the other day on capitalism, what I see as late stage capitalism, and what I personally think is the root cause of all of the systemic problems that we're seeing today. One important thing to do when we discuss this is to actually define some of the terms. And whenever you speak about capitalism, the antithesis will always be socialism or communism. And I think it's really important to discuss what those things actually mean, because some of these terms have been completely co-opted and turned into propaganda. For example, the term socialism, many people think of if we pool stuff together and give it out to someone. That's socialism. Under these terms, the bailouts given out under capitalism during COVID and previous recessions would be defined as socialist things, when in fact that's not what socialism actually means. So what does socialism actually mean? Socialism actually means to take the means of production and give it to the workers, give it to the people who actually perform the labor and give the value into the system. And because these videos have to be geared towards the greater audience, it's really important that these videos keep things simple. And the goal is to wake people up to not only how to live a better life, but also to understand the systems of corruption that are oppressing us. And the reason this is important is how I see collapse happening. A lot of people think that collapse hasn't happened yet, that it's something that the future will bring, that the ice caps will melt, methane will get released, extinctions will happen, and then civilization will collapse. Collapse actually is going to be slightly different. And here is my opinion. And I want to be really clear when I'm giving opinion versus fact. This is my opinion. Collapse will not happen like that. Collapse is already happening, and it has been happening for decades. Collapse will be similar to frogs boiling in a pot. The temperature gets raised a degree at a time, and before you know it, the frogs don't realize that they're actually being boiled alive. Now, although this example doesn't actually play out that way in real life, it's still a good analogy for how collapse will happen. And what do I mean by that? For people my age or older, we can probably remember going on road trips in the car, and by the time you got to a cottage or a friend's house for the summertime camping, your car would be covered in bugs. These days, when you get to your final destination, you probably won't see any bugs on your car. And while that might seem like a good thing if you don't like scraping bugs off of the car, it's telling about how the insect biome has completely and utterly been collapsing over the last 50 years. The amount of diversity that we've lost in the last few decades is absolutely staggering. And how this relates to the frogs boiling in the pot is that my kids are growing up and this is normal to them. It's normal for them to get to the camping trip and not see the car covered in bugs. So then it begs the question, what is normal to me that I consider to be just the way the world is, that if my great-great-grandparents witnessed, they would say that I've experienced collapse. A good personal example of this would be fishing. I took my kids on a fishing trip with my father.
Yeah, you might have a pickerel. He's on top.
On top of the water. Hiding down now. Wait. Decent size.
Ask this game. No one's lost the point yet.
Oh, we're at 7 now. 3, 2, 1, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Done.
Oh my god, that one's so hard. That's so far in. I got it a tiny bit.
You're 1 out of 3.
The reason I think that they might to some degree is because
Count.
Three,
how
two,
identical
one,
every
one.
You get 3 seconds?
It's not even fair.
Well, we're going down each round.
It's not even fair.
On that fishing trip, he told me stories about how his grandfather and his father used to go fishing, and they would fill the boat with fish where it was so full that the boat was actually falling and sinking. Now, we can possibly attribute some of this to embellishment of old stories, but I've seen pictures of the fish that they would pull out of lakes, and we would go fishing for hours and hours and hours and barely catch anything. There's no fish left in our lakes. A big part of that could have been unsustainable fishing practices, but it happens when we don't put sustainability and the environment as the number one goal that we absolutely have to meet. And if something isn't sustainable at this level, it just simply does not happen. This is something that we need to implement today. And my biggest problem with capitalism stems from this exact characteristic, that the negative implications of capitalism are not factored in to the profits of a company. And additionally, the positive implications of a company's operation also do not factor into the company's bottom line and profit. And that means that industries like coal, oil and gas, transportation, cement, steel manufacturing, and agriculture do not actually factor in the environmental repercussions of their business operation into whether or not they should do something. And in fact, if their business operations are negative to the environment, they have a financial incentive to their shareholders to spend money in order to create propaganda or media campaigns to mitigate or minimize the public's perception of this negative. And we see that in the coal, oil, and gas industry and farming especially, where we see campaigns about all these sustainable regenerative practices, but when you dig deeper into the information, you find out that only 1% of what they're actually spending in their company's budget is going towards these sustainable practices. And in fact, the marketing campaigns to say these things are costing more than the actual funding for the programs that they're marketing.
Hey, I'm doing a thing about how BP invented the carbon footprint. Oh, you already knew about that? This whole thing started as a way for BP to deal with that thorny little PR nightmare. You might know it as climate change. And if you don't believe in climate change, first of all, thank you so much for watching. But regardless of whether you do or don't believe in climate change, it's irrelevant because BP officially does believe in climate change, and not just internally. In a 2005 advertisement, they proudly exclaimed, "We became the first major energy company to publicly acknowledge the need to take steps against global warming." And with a serious statement like that, I mean, oh boy, I think we can really expect BP to divest from oil and invest in renewable energy. And what do you mean that didn't happen at all? Like at all? But you can't just fake it, right? I mean, you gotta have a little thing called showmanship. And that's why BP hired marketing superstars Ogilvy and Mather.
Ogilvy and Mather.
And they gave them the paltry sum of $250 million to make them appear environmentally conscious without the obvious downside of actually having to care about the environment. Anyway, apparently this whole blank is Greek for other blank thing is an old advertising standby because the Ogilvy and Mather boys named the BP rebrand the Helios campaign, which is of course Greek for sun. They actually spent more money telling people about their solar energy projects than they did on their solar energy projects.
And what this means for the economy is that if you have two cement companies and one is just business as usual producing cement and the other one is spending money on research and innovation and trying to get cleaner ways to actually procure and produce cement, the non-innovating company is actually going to be able to outcompete the innovating company. It's for that exact reason that we don't have human innovation going towards things that don't directly benefit the shareholder. And this is what free market capitalism creates. It creates these situations where the only thing that companies look for is a bottom line, short-term profit to their shareholders. So let's get back to socialism versus capitalism versus communism. And often when someone is critical of capitalism, people will then say they're a socialist or a communist, and these words trigger some people, and they shouldn't, because they're just alternate forms of government. And if there's emotional response triggered by just hearing about another system of governance, it probably should be an indicator of just how brainwashed is a strong word, but maybe programmed we are in order to resist against any kind of change. And you have to ask yourself, where is this resistance coming from? Is it genuine? Is it coming from me? And I'll give an example later on when we talk about a carbon tax as an example of a way that I actually identified that I was actually being programmed to dislike something First, let's talk about the distinction between social democracy and democratic socialism. These are two really important terms and they're completely different. Social democracy is what Canada has in form of the NDP party, or what maybe the United States would have in a senator like Bernie Sanders. These are both highly capitalist systems. However, they have social programs as their core. So they would be a little more left-leaning than current centrist or even right-leaning capitalism, but they're not socialism at all, because the fundamental thing with socialism is that the means of production are with the workers. And under these systems, the means of production are continued to be with the owner, with the bourgeoisie class. So whether you have a social program where money is pooled and funneled and then given to people, say for example for education or for welfare, this is not socialism. This is a social program under capitalism. It's important to recognize the difference. Socialism is when the workers actually control the means of production, and their labor and the profits from that labor, the value for that labor, goes back to the people performing the labor. And the funny thing about the typical person who will dislike socialism is that socialism is the single governmental policy that would probably benefit them directly the most. But they're ingrained to think through this corruption of the term socialism that their money will go to people who don't want to work. That's actually kind of the complete opposite of what socialism attempts to do. It tries to reward directly the people who perform the labor. So let's go through an example to kind of explain the difference. Imagine after watching permaculture videos on a food forest, the watchers want to come together and buy some land, create a business, a co-op, where they will plant a food forest and gardens and sell the food, and this is how they'll actually earn a living. There's two ways they could go about that. They can come together and actually buy the land, the means of production, and then perform the labor, get the food off of the land, sell the food, and the profit goes to them. Now compare that instead to a situation where a group of commenters come together with the hopes of raising a food forest, but they instead go to somebody who has land. They go to a capitalist who's sitting on 100,000 acres, and they create a food forest and gardens using their land. And then the viewers actually perform the labor and do all the work to actually both grow the food, market it, sell it, and manage the finances of the company. However, at the end of the day, the means of production, the land, is actually resting entirely with the landowner. So the profits are now split between the workers who are doing all the labor and creating the actual value and the actual capitalist who owns the land. And this is a perfect example of why I actually don't dislike pure theoretical capitalism, because I actually think that situation is fairly fair. And the thing that defines how fair is to look at the extremes. How much money is actually going to the people who create the labor versus the person who owns the means of production, the land. And this is my problem with capitalism, is that a fair ratio might be somewhere between 80% goes to the workers, 20% to the landowner, to, I don't know, maybe even 50-50. But what it absolutely should not be is that 99.999% of that money goes back to the landowner and only 0.00001% goes to the people who actually created the labor. And that is the social economic system called capitalism that we have today. So this is a good example to show how I'm not necessarily against capitalism if it's equitable. But current capitalism is absolutely exploitative towards the working class. My opinion is that all forms of capitalism, as soon as capitalism moves from stakeholder capitalism to shareholder capitalism, it will always progress to the point of the most extreme disparity and inequality. And this is because the capitalist company who would own the land has an obligation to the shareholders, the people who actually own shares in the company, to maximize the return to those shareholders. Therefore, every single financial decision will be done in order to maximize the value. And one of those dial knobs that they can change to adjust the ratio is the salary towards the workers. And they will crank that down as low as possible, and they will remove as many benefits to the workers that cost the company money as possible until they get to the point where the workers refuse to work anymore. So one way that workers can actually defend themselves inside this exploitive capitalist system is to actually create unions. Now, unions are also a triggering word to certain people. I know my father would get triggered by this because he hates unions. For example, in the USA, in 1940, 33.9% of the workforce was unionized. And this was actually mostly in the private sector, actually. Only 4% of the public sector was unionized at that time. By 2022, it has completely reversed, and 36% of the public sector is currently unionized, and only 6% of the private sector is unionized, with 11.3% of the total population sitting inside unions, compared to 33.9% in 1940. Now, between 1940 and the late 1970s is when the US had the highest percentage of workers being part of a union. The American dream was something that came about from the early 1900s towards the 1970s, 1980s. And it's only been since then that the average American realizes that the American dream is actually an American nightmare. It's not possible anymore. And this is also true, maybe to a lesser extent, in countries like Canada, where I'm from. Now, the discussion so far has largely been around socioeconomic consequences of capitalism, but the largest consequences of capitalism is actually the environmental and the impact on the natural world. Now, as I stated before, the impact to the natural world is not factored into a company's decision because there's no financial incentive for them to actually care about it. And one thing I know as a parent is that if you want your kids to do something, incentivize them to do it, and they will do it. If they have a monetary incentive or a reward incentive to do a task like cleaning up after themselves, they'll do it. If they don't, and you'll just go clean up after themselves afterwards, you can believe that they won't do it. The same thing happens for all humanity. We all operate to min-max the rules that we're constrained in the systems that we operate. For a company, that is the tax implications, that is budgetary implications, and if there's no environmental factor inside those, then they just simply won't do it. Enter the carbon tax. Now, for many of you, I might have just triggered you because the carbon tax feels bad. It feels bad when you're a hardworking person who's just scraping by, you go to the pump and the gas costs more. And this emotional weapon is used by political opponents of a carbon tax. And largely, I was against a carbon tax. And the reason why is that I'm actually for a carbon tax if you tax carbon pollution emitters, but then you actually return that money and use it to give subsidies for solar, subsidies for electric vehicles, and take money off of the polluters of our environment and then give it to sustainable regenerative practices. Now, I do still have a little problem with the carbon tax that it only talks about carbon, and carbon pollution into the air is just one factor of pollution and environmental destruction. For example, you can go and you can clear out ecosystems as long as you get the right permit, which Doug Ford, for example, in Ontario shows that it goes to the highest bidder when you want to, for example, develop the green belt.
We will open up the green belt, not all of it. We're going to open a big chunk of it up, and we're going to start building and making it more affordable and putting more houses out there. The demand for single dwelling homes is huge, but no one can afford them. So we need to start building affordable housing. I've already talked to some of the biggest developers in this country. And again, I wish I could say it's my idea, but it was their idea as well. Give us property, we'll build, and we'll drive the cost down. That's my plan for affordable housing. I give you my commitment that anything that we look at on the Greenbelt will be replaced. So there'll still be the equal amount of Greenbelt.
These are real places that exist in the real world. You can't pretend that if you develop them that somehow you're going to replace them.
Now, perhaps if developing the Greenbelt incurred a financial penalty, it wouldn't be financially lucrative anymore to actually destroy the natural environment to put condos up. So back to the carbon tax. I actually realized that I had a real negative connotation when I thought of the words carbon tax. And I thought, well, why is that? I've never actually really done a lot of digging into where that money goes. The reality of the carbon tax, and this information is going to be only applicable to Canada, is that 90% of the money from the carbon tax actually just gets directly paid back to the people. And it gets directly paid back at tax season. So 90% of the money makes it back to the consumers. And when you go into details about how much money the average person makes or loses based on the carbon tax, the vast majority of people actually make money by the fact that the carbon tax exists. Now, it feels like you lose money because you go to the pump and you actually pay more money, but you actually will get back more at tax season than you spend. Now, the price at the pump is not the only source of a carbon tax. For example, natural gas also has a carbon tax associated with it. But there's actually two parts of the carbon tax. And one is that point at consumption, which is when we buy gasoline or natural gas. Those are the ones that we really see. But there's also a business performance-based system that most of us don't see. And that relates to how a company operates and what their actual carbon emissions are in the operation of the company. So crucially, it's this money here that gets funneled into that pool of money that's given back to all Canadians. So for example, a steel company who's doing nothing to reduce emissions is now taking some of their profits, pooling it in, and that's going back to the average consumer. So that's where 90% of the money goes. Where does the other 10% go? The other 10% goes partly towards repaying Indigenous communities where we have created ecosystem destruction in order to harvest some of these resources. And for another part of it, Canada understands that in some areas of Canada, more rural communities, it's not going to be possible for somebody to, say, take public transport to their job. And farmers are another example of an industry where they're forced to buy gasoline because, giant electric farming vehicles don't quite exist on an economic scale yet. So operation of their business depends partly on being, a prisoner of having to buy some of these fossil fuels to run their actual business. Now, overall, that means that over 90% of this money is going back to hardworking Canadians who are just trying to get by on life. And a big portion of that money, and a big portion of the money going into the system, is actually getting funded by corporations who don't give a crap about the environment and are continuing to pollute. It is really important to recognize that corporations lobby governments, and then governments pass legislation based on that lobbying in order to promote destructive economic practices. And the people who want to stop that are constantly having to fight this propaganda machine that's going out convincing people that this is a bad thing.
Soon every pump in Ontario will have to display this sticker outlining the federal government's carbon tax. It's going to have to go right on the pump somewhere, and for those who don't comply, they'll face fines of up to $10,000. But how is this all going to be enforced? Well, since announcing the plan April 8th, the Ford government hasn't said. What about cost to the taxpayer of making the stickers? No answer to that either. What Energy Minister Greg Rifford did say was the stickers are about being able to, quote, stick it to the Liberals.
We just want to inform the public. This is why the gas prices are going up.
It's got nothing to do with anything except for the government of Ontario trying to pinch hit for Andrew Scheer and the federal Conservatives. And they're using our public dollars, our public tax dollars here in Ontario to do that.
This comes as the province and the feds face off in the Ontario Court of Appeal also over the federal carbon tax. The cost of that is also on the taxpayers.
Lots of it has been made about the carbon price stickers that your government is mandating go on the pumps. They show them what the carbon price adds to the price of gas. They don't show what the rebate is that many Canadians get. Of course, the concern is that, the owners of the gas stations who don't display them could be fined up to $10,000 per day. Does your government intend to enforce those fines, sir?
Well, first of all, that was the media that's always said that. The fines are below.
Your minister did, though, respectfully, sir.
We have the responsibility to tell the people in Ontario where their money's going, no matter if it's a carbon tax or other taxes. But, this carbon tax, it's not going to be the courts that are going to decide. The people are going to decide when the election's held. Once the people decide, I believe in democracy, I respect democracy, we move on. The people have the opportunity, not the courts.
So you will enforce the fines?
Again, we'll see how this goes. We will enforce them if these gas stations aren't putting them up.
Now, everything that I've stated regarding carbon tax is based on Canada and Ontario, Canada specifically even. So if you actually dislike the carbon tax, just double check if you actually do, and go research where that money goes, how it gets funded, who it gets paid to, how much gets paid to them, and make your mind up for yourself. Do you actually dislike a carbon tax, or are you just being brainwashed? I find it very difficult that someone who is supporting permaculture and wants to protect the environment would actually dislike the carbon tax. And I recognize that carbon is not the only thing, that more CO2 into the air will actually tend to grow more plants. But if you think that carbon is not a problem at all, please go check out my video on carbon specifically, because carbon is absolutely a problem. Yes, more carbon will create higher ppm CO2 in the atmosphere. Yes, higher ppm in the environment will cause plants to grow faster to a point. But one of the things that has to hold true in order for that to happen is that the water cycle has to be maintained, because the photosynthesis equation is CO2 plus water plus energy equals sugars plus oxygen. So if you don't have the water going in 1-to-1 with a CO2 molecule, the plants will not perform photosynthesis. And when we're destroying our water systems, when we're creating loss of topsoil, when we're having erosion and droughts, and we're having record fires, the CO2 and the photosynthesis is not actually capturing all of that. When we're constantly destroying ecosystems, deforesting our forests, and removing grasslands, then when CO2 goes up, the plants actually can't take it all out of the environment. In order for this to remain true, and it was true in the past, we have to restore our natural systems so that we get our CO2 sinks back in service. And this is why arguments like CO2 levels were higher in historical past in terms of ppm, therefore we're okay, are completely ridiculous arguments, because the world is different than it was before humans started paving it over and cutting down all the forests. So yes, the old world could actually handle higher CO2 ppm levels. So if you're the kind of person who says carbon tax, carbon's just this fake made up thing, it's greenwashing, governments are just trying to take money from us and give it to their buddies. Look, I'm not saying that's not happening, because anytime you've got humans involved, you've got greed. And Democrats and Republicans, they're all the same evil monster. And, underneath their hood is just ExxonMobil. They're the same person. The real actual fight isn't between left and right. It's actually between the rich and the poor. And this is why a carbon tax, being a bad thing that takes your money and gives it to lazy people, is such an effective marketing tool, because it just feels like that. It feels when you go to the pump and it costs you more, that's a bad thing. And where's that money going to? It's going to big government and all of these greenwashing crap, because carbon's not right? It's really important that we kind of validate these things that are being told to us and wonder who's got financial incentive to actually brainwash us and program us into thinking these things. And again, opinion. This is my opinion. The research that I've done through IPCC reports, through carbon tax, through 18 years in the power energy sector in renewables, my personal research is saying that carbon tax is a good thing, that CO2 is real and is a human-driven problem, and that we do need to solve it. And the vast, vast, vast majority of scientists agree. Yes, there is corrupted science out there, and yes, that's a problem. It's not like ExxonMobil hasn't done corrupted science for about 100 years now. Their own internal climate science predicted where we are and where we're going, and they paid money to hide it and bury it. So yes, corrupted science does exist, and for more information on that, check out my carbon video where I go into a little bit more detail on that. And honestly, don't even listen to me. Just go to the IPCC reports and listen to the actual climate experts who are in their fields of study who aren't benefiting financially from any of this. I find it funny when someone's argument is that the climate scientists are the ones who are biased, but not the actual government who's being funded by the coal, oil, and gas industry. That's not biased. The mental gymnastics are just ridiculous. I think we'll leave it at that. I'm kind of in rant mode. So thanks for watching. I hope this video helped kind of elucidate and explain more about what's the difference between a socialist program or a social program, probably better to state it that way. A social program such as welfare or tax bailouts for the rich that occur under capitalism, and compare that to what socialism actually means. And that isn't me saying that I think that the world should become socialist. I'm just saying that the current capitalist regime is just so out of sync and disproportion towards inequality. And I would be fine with a capitalist system where, in our example, the farmer, the landowner, doesn't keep 99% of the profits. It's more equitably distributed. And that negative environmental implications are priced into the company's operating budgets, as well as rewarding companies who are actually seeking innovation in order to reduce their environmental impacts. Right now, doing so is actually a death knell to the company because you're spending money on something that's not affecting your bottom line. I think we have to incentivize things like smart steel production, smart cement production, regenerative agriculture. These things are things where we have to financially incentivize people in order to actually do the thing. If you want to see behavior, reward and incentivize the behavior that you want to see. It's as simple as that. To me, capitalism will never get there. It will never do that because capitalism is too focused on shareholder profits, and it has to be through a social program where we actually control and reward the behaviors that we need absolutely critically to see in order to sustain and regenerate our planet for our kids and our grandkids. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next one.